Talk real quick about some things I was thinking about, actually, from a conversation I had about what is the world. And we were talking a little about how James says, love not the world. You know, if you're friends with the world, you've got enmity with God. Why? And I just kind of thought, what is the world? The world is basically man living as an orphan, as if God is not his provider. So when Cain went out from the presence of God, he built cities, uh, developed methods of entertainment, agriculture, and weaponry and armor, learning how to defend for himself, entertain himself, provide for himself. And that all became, and then living together, that all became a system that eventually became like their god. They worked for the things in that system, and the one who held the means of production uh, to make these things and provide them to people became their daddy in a way, in a negative way, because they had to work for it. And uh, so that eventually comes together at Babel. There's a new development, which is not just that they're living as an orphan, fending for themselves, providing for themselves, working for their own provision, but now they're building up a identity in it. So at Babel, they say, "Let us build a tower and a name for ourselves, lest we be scattered." It's about their name. It's about their reputation, and we know that Nimrod there was worshipped. So uh, it was about even, you know, receiving glory from one another based on their position in this system of things that man was working for to provide for himself because he'd been cut off from God. Now he's looking for his own identity and his own righteousness in that system. And so now, because he needs all these things to survive and entertain himself and everything, and he's willing to sell himself to work for these things, and he measures his righteousness by his position in this system of things, he is able to be manipulated so that good and evil can be turned upside down. And what is good is all about how you're positioned in these things and how you are sustaining the system. Okay? And building the system. It's all about the system. That's the world. Okay? Now, the people on the line of life, I call it, the line from Seth onward through Abraham and Isaac and Jacob, all lived apart from this system and yet were abundantly provided for by God. They had entertainment, they had ways of sustaining themselves and arming themselves and protecting themselves, But even when they protected themselves, it was by God's doing. I mean, Abraham went in with 300 trained men and conquered the kings. That was a miraculous feat of God. Melchizedek told him that it was God who had given him that victory. So these Old Testament victories you see are supernatural. The Lord is the captain of the host. He's the one who fights on behalf of his people, you know. So God is the provider. And the difference is that God is the provider versus the orphans in the system. And so when James and John tell us about loving the world, Jesus didn't take us out of the world, but at the same time, he doesn't pray for the world. He prays for those whom the Father gave to him, to whom he gives life, which is the knowledge of the Father and the Son. And he declares the name of the Father to us, and that makes us no longer orphans, but sons of God. Because the Spirit comes to us as the Comforter. The Spirit comes to us as the knowledge of God. And he goes from being the consuming fire on the Mount Sinai, right? But to the unknowable God, to becoming our Father. And as we see that he is our Father, we change from working for the things that the Gentiles do and measuring by ourselves by them, to believing that God knows what we have need of before we ask, that we don't have to seek those things, because if he takes care of the lilies and clothes them even more glory than Solomon, how much more will he take care of his children that he loves, and he knows the number of hairs on our head? And sufficient for tomorrow is the evil thereof. Today is the evil thereof. I don't have to worry about tomorrow. I'm not living for tomorrow. I'm not living in fear of the future or building up something for myself in the future. But each day is a gift from the Lord. And as I live like that, the Father who loves me and gives me all things to enjoy blesses my socks off. I'm blessed. Abraham was blessed. They didn't live in poverty. You don't have to live in poverty to not love the world, nor does living in poverty mean you won't love the world, because some people have a whole identity about living in this austere lifestyle, bohemian lifestyle, and they think they're so cool, and they think that they have repudiated the yuppies and the county people, and they're not materialistic while they talk on their iPhones made by slaves in China. I mean, the hypocrisy is crazy. No, we are, the root of it, the problem is looking at yourself as an orphan and then depending on the world to meet your needs, willing to sell yourself to the world to work for those things, and then building up an identity, a name, and even a righteousness in the world based on how you sustain the system and contribute to it. And that's really sad with the churches and the social justice movement today, is that they're identifying themselves increasingly with the world system and calling what is good that which furthers the blessing on the system, so to speak. But it's not a blessed system. We make a distinction. We know that God loved the world, the people in it, but we also know that the world is under the influence of Satan and his principalities and the Illuminati or whatever, and they are influencing opinion to turn good and evil upside down, so that increasingly to side with the world and love the things in it makes you a hater of that which is good and a hater of God. So we can't be friends with the world, but at the same time, that does not mean that we don't have the blessing of God, which includes material provision. And I used to be under the yoke of feeling like being blessed was a problem, and I was always anxious that I was going to be like Job and he was going to take everything, you know. Now I know that all can happen, and yet God will provide for me every day. Every day. And the more I know that he is providing for me, the more blessed I feel like I am. And it's interesting because I used to live in corporate IT, and I would work, and I would have a steady income that I could depend on, and I worked for it. And there was a direct correlation between my work and that which I received. And so that was one of the reasons why I was so anxious about money all the time, was because if I stopped working, the money would stop. Well, now I do this wedding thing with the piano playing, and sometimes I'll start a month and I'll have zero on the books, and I'll start to get really nervous. And then I'll tell the Lord, I'm not supposed to be worried about this. You said let each day take care of itself and let you take care tomorrow. I'm not supposed to be anxious and caring for these things like the Gentiles do. You know what I need. And sure enough, money comes. Either I'll get all kinds of last minute bookings, or I'll get a whole bunch of inquiries and I'll book events for months later or the next year, but then each one has a deposit. Well, the deposit's non-refundable, so I can live on it now. So like July, I had almost nothing on the books. It was terrible. I was like, wow, you know. But I had enough in savings from the abundant months, May and June, and then I got a whole bunch of deposits, and it just worked out where I had exactly what I needed, you know. I mean, and it always works out. God has always provided for me. It's amazing. And it's not because of what I do, it's because I'm not an orphan. And I do live well, you know, and I'm not very good with money. I'm really not. I'm terrible at money. But I try to be generous, and I try not to worry about money and hoard it and live in anxiety about it, you know. And I pray that that'll continue, you know. I pray that the Lord will keep me in this grace, which He will, because He's my Father. And the more I see that He's my Father providing for me, the less I'm worried. And that is really what not loving the world, I believe, is all about. All right. See ya.